All right, we're reviewing the different contexts between chapter 1, Genesis 1, 9 through 13, and chapter 2, beginning of the first verse of chapter 2, which is really 2, 4b to 6. Now take a look again at Genesis 1, 9 to 13. Compare it, pay attention. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit, according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the third day. Remember that, third day. Now let's bounce forward. Well, take a look at 1, 9 to 10. Because Henry Morris has something to say about this. "In the day that the Lord God made the heavens and the earth, on the third day when the dry land appeared. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Now let's get a scientist's point of view on this, the nitpicking little details. Especially on the third day, Henry Morris states, there was a tremendous amount of geological work accomplished. On the third day, the Genesis account tells us the dry land was made to appear above the surface of the waters. This process would necessarily have been accompanied by great erosion and redeposition of surface materials as the waters flowed down into the new basins. He goes on to say in his book, the waters under the firmament, in other words, on the surface of the earth, still constituted a shoreless ocean in which probably all of the material elements were randomly dissolved or suspended. Tremendous chemical reactions then got underway, as dissolved elements precipitated and combined with others to form the vast complex of minerals and rocks making up the solid earth, its crust, its mantle, and its core. The materials so formed tended in general, with many localized exceptions, to arrange themselves isostatically, equal pressure from every side, with heavier materials sinking and lighter materials floating, and with many substances still in suspension or solution. Amazing. We'll see the details of this. New heavens and a new earth. Great earth movements also got underway in response to differential heating and other forces. Finally, surfaces of solid earth appeared above the waters, and an intricate network of channels and reservoirs opened up in the crust to receive the waters retreating off the rising continents. Some of these reservoirs were opened directly to the waters descending from above. Others were formed as great subterranean chambers within the crust itself. All were interconnected by a complex network of tubes and waterways, so that in essence they were all gathered together unto one place. Although in one place, the waters had assembled in numerous distinct basins, some underground, some adjacent to the ground, so that God called this gathering together of the waters seas, a plural term. Psalm 33:7. He, God, gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap, or as in a water skin. He lays up the deeps in storehouses. He lays up the deeps deep in the storehouses. God gathers up the waters, the seas, into the underground storehouses, i.e. into subterranean caverns. These waves were, of course, not the same as our present seas, since the antediluvian arrangement of continental and marine seas was completely changed at the time of the flood. Finally, these foundations of the earth, Psalm 102:25, Job 38, Zechariah, Isaiah, and so on, had been perfectly laid, and God called the dry land earth. This name, the Hebrew eretz, is the same as used in Genesis 1, 1 and 2, showing that the formless matter originally created is the same matter as used in the finally constituted solid ground. All of this was accomplished during the first part of the third day of creation. Genesis 1:11-13. The time span for the creation of vegetation of the earth on the earth was part of a literal 24-hour day in which fully mature plant life appeared. Take a look at these verses. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields its fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the third day. So now, at the beginning of the third day of creation, that the earth is prepared to grow vegetation, it is ready for the next state of God's creative process, plant life. And Genesis 1:11-13 stipulates that by the end of the third day, out of the earth came full-grown grasses, herbs, and trees, each kind able to yield seeds in order to reproduce after its kind. Three main orders of plant life are in view: grasses, herbs, and trees, which implies the creation of all types of plants. Morris goes on to say, on the same day, the record says, God made vegetation of all kinds to appear, implying that there was now a uniform mantle of fertile soil over the surface. The Hebrew word translated as herbs in this verse comes from the Hebrew masculine noun eseb, meaning grass or herb. The Hebrew masculine noun eseb, which is one of the four major synonyms for vegetation, verdure, herb, or grass. The English herb, found in the King James Version, is used in the broader and older sense of non-woody tissue vegetation, rather than in the more restricted nuance of seasoning or medicinal plants. Eseb and its synonyms correspond more closely to the American English use of the word plant rather than to herb. In the creation account, this word has its most important role. On the third creative day, God called for the earth to sprout forth vegetation, deshe, plants, eseb, yielding seed, and fruit trees, esper, bearing fruit with its seed within, each according to its kind on the earth, and God saw that it was good. In this context, deshe, vegetation, appears to be the broader category, subsuming both eseb and plants and trees. Let the earth sprout, dasha, bring forth, sprout up, or spring up. Objectors to a literal six-day creation maintain that bring forth, dasha, indicates that a long time span was needed for plant life to sprout up, not just one 24-hour day. However, a very similar verb form is used to indicate God's creation of animals on the sixth day. Genesis 1:24. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures." Bring forth, yatsa. So the context in both cases is one of a literal 24-hour day in which what was indicated as brought forth was completed in that specific 24-hour time span. So verses 11 and 24 cannot be referring to plant life growing out of seeds from the ground or animal life being born and then growing up. Instead, both verses teach of the sudden creation, God being who he is, of both plants and animals in mature form and in abundance. Consider for a moment that the objectors are correct, that plant life took millions of years to evolve, and that animal life would then take another set of eons to arrive in creation. How then would the plant life have survived without the insects which pollinate the plants and which provide vital nutrients in the soil, and so on? God would have had to have supernaturally provided for the plant life's survival. So why not just have God do what he says we did? Supernaturally create all plant life in maturity in one literal 24-hour day, and then the animal life in maturity several days later, so that the interdependencies of which he built in could operate for a mutual survival. Furthermore, the objectors presuppose a post-flood, slower-growing world existed at the time of creation, and not the immeasurably faster growth world of creation times. They also limit God from being able to sprout up plants in one day. Similarly, if the evolutionists are right, and they are not, then how did animal life evolve first rather than plant life, and then survive for millions of years if innumerable animal species were directly or indirectly dependent upon plant life for a food supply, which supposedly would not be existing until millions of years later? So there's a problem here. Let's just take what the words say in God's Word. Promoters of the interpretation that God recreated the earth and life thereon after it fell into chaos and extinction after many ages maintained that plant life, was recreated from dormant seeds. But verse 11 of Genesis 1 cannot be limited to exclude the possibility of original creation rather than a recreation of what was already there. The context and syntax of the passage do not permit this exclusion, and other passages do exclude a recreation of a regrowth from already existent dormant seeds, especially the passages which state that man was there at the beginning of creation, not recreation. Remember that verse in Mark? Jesus replied, but at the beginning of creation, God made the male and female. So that kind of leaves that out. Henry Morris states, not only had rocks and minerals been formed, but so had a blanket of fertile soil, sand, silt, and clay-sized particles in an ideally graded mixture with abundant chemical nutrients and soil moisture. Then God spoke again, this time organizing certain of the chemical elements of the earth into tremendously complex systems, each with a marvelous informational program built into its chemical structure, which could henceforth specify the reproduction of other units like itself. There is no suggestion that these systems possessed any form of consciousness, but each did have its seed in itself, and so had the ability to reproducing of its kind. The three main orders of plant life are mentioned: grasses, herbs, and trees. The three are intended to cover all types of plants, and these are the most obvious comprehensive categories. It is significant that these plants were made not as seeds, but as full-grown plants whose seed was in themselves. Thus they had an appearance of age. The concept of creation of apparent age does not, of course, suggest a divine deception, but is a necessary accompaniment of genuine creation. The processes operating in Creation Week were not the processes of the present era, but were processes of creating and making, and are thus not commensurate with present processes at all. Furthermore, God did not say, let the land produce seeds which will grow into plants. Instead, he said, let the land sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees already bearing fruit with seed in them. Adam was created as a full-grown man. The trees were created as full-grown trees, and the whole universe was made as a functioning entity, complete and fully developed right from the beginning, even with light arriving from distant stars. The apparent age that might be calculated in terms of present processes is irrelevant and would undoubtedly be vastly different from the true age as revealed by the Creator. In verse 11 occurs the first mention of both seed and kind. Implanted in each created organism was a seed programmed to enable the continuing replication of that type of organism. The modern understanding of the extreme complexities of the so-called DNA molecule and the genetic code contained in it has reinforced the biblical teaching of the stability of kinds, as opposed to the evolution of one kind into another. Each type of organization had its own unique structure of the DNA and can only specify the reproduction of that same kind. There is a tremendous amount of variational potential within each kind, facilitating the generation of distinct individuals and even of many varieties within the kind, but nevertheless precluding the evolution of new kinds. A great deal of horizontal within species variation is easily possible, but no vertical species to species changes. It is significant that the phrase after his kind occurs 10 times in the first chapter of Genesis. Each organism was to reproduce after its own kind, not after some other kind. The evolutionary dogma that all living things are interrelated by common ancestries and descent is refuted by these biblical statements, as well as by all established scientific observations made to date. Compare 1 Corinthians 15:38-39, which indicates that there are different kinds of living beings which are not related to one another, especially via some evolutionary process. But God gives it a body as he pleases, and to each seed its own body. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of animals, another of fish, another of birds, each after its own kind. So Henry Morris goes on to say, it should also be mentioned that the formation of plants, even in some complex forms, as fruit trees, occurred before the creation of any form of animal life. This, of course, is quite logical, but it does flatly contradict the accepted evolutionary system, which has marine animals, both invertebrates and vertebrates, evolving hundreds of millions of years before the evolution of fruit trees and other higher plants. Furthermore,